Welcome to Long Story Short. I'm Beth LaMontagne Hall, your host for tonight. We're back in the 3S Artspace Theater with 3 storytellers tonight. We have Gail Knowles, Charlene Thorburn, and Holly Russell. And we have a Pink Pumpkin style story later in the show because you know it's not long story short unless there's some audience participation. So recently I've been talking to a lot of people around town and on the podcast about this show, how the last year's been going. And in those conversations, one of the things I've been asking people is for them to tell me what makes a good story. So at its core, a story is really just beginning, middle, and end, right? But people come here to this event to see something more. Usually the storytellers will have an aha moment. Sometimes there's a story where the stakes are really high and the storyteller has something really big on the line. Other times it's just the fact that they're a really good storyteller and they're great at drawing you in, making you laugh, and even showing some vulnerability. What I've seen here throughout this series is you really know it's a good story when everybody is in it. When the audience laughs together, they cringe together, or sometimes they're just in complete silence, hanging on every word that storyteller has to say. It's an energy you can feel throughout the room, and it's something that I have really missed. So we don't have an audience here tonight, obviously, but we hopefully will soon. And instead, we wanted to try to capture that connectedness, that energy, and come up with a different way of presenting the stories that'll bring that to you at home. So please be a part of that connectedness, and feel free to use the chat and some emojis on your screen. Send love to these storytellers. You know, I say at every live show, here at Long Story Short, we're a really welcoming audience. So if you like what you hear tonight, you can listen to more stories like this on our podcast, the Long Story Short podcast. We have stories and interviews, and you can find information about that on longstoryshortpod.com. It's also where you go to sign up to tell a story at future shows, to get on the email list, to stay in touch. And speaking of future shows, we have 3 more in 2021 that are scheduled to be here. Hopefully we'll get an audience in some of these. On June 9th, we have Lost and Found. On September 8th, the theme is Crushed, Stories of Young Love. And on December 8th, we have Family Heirloom. We have openings for all of these shows, so if you're interested in getting involved in storytelling, getting up on stage, if you do storytelling, go to longstoryshortpod.com to find out how to sign up for one. All right, let's get started. Our first storyteller tonight is Gail Knowles. She's a tattooed Photoshop monkey, mom, wife, feminist, a biker, and an organic gardener, and owner of Frontier Justice Digital. Please give it up for a fantastic storyteller and a force of nature, Gail Knowles.
Okay, I always want to say my name is Gail and I'm an alcoholic, but I did that last time, so I won't do it this time. So this is about relatives and family to me. That's what that theme meant. So the rings. Let me set the scene. A small house on Long Island built by my dad's family. The cesspool in the front of the house was full, and with us not being able to afford professionals and knowing people who could help out, my dad and his brothers and some neighbors dug a big hole in the front yard to put in the new cesspool, which is basically a giant cement cylinder with holes in it, and then on top of it, it has this huge lid that covers everything up, all the nasty. After placing the cylinder in the ground and getting the lid on it, my dad got his finger caught in between the sidewall and the lid, and it squished it pretty good. So his hand started to swell up immediately, so he took his wedding ring off and he put it in his pocket. Later that night, when he got out of the shower, he looked in his pocket for the ring, and it was nowhere to be found. He, my mom, and my sisters spent a bunch of time over the next 2 weeks looking for it everywhere in the yard, and we could never find it, which is when we first heard the story about the wedding rings. As my parents' wedding approached in 1953, my mom, who lived in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, would walk to the subway every day to go to her job in Manhattan. And on her way to the subway station, she would pass by stores, which were all closed because it was, the crack of dawn. And she noticed a small jewelry store that had a box of rings in the window, and they were marked on sale. So she went back on a Saturday. The box of rings were from people that wanted custom rings, ordered them, put their down payment, but then never turned up to pick up the rings for whatever reason. My mother liked platinum and white gold, and my dad liked yellow gold. So my mom got the one she liked and got another one for my dad. She was so excited by the rings and the savings. She showed them to my dad, all excited, and all he said was, "They don't match." My mom tried to explain to him that they were different types of jewelry that they liked and they should each get what they wanted, but I think that conversation showed you a lot about my parents' relationship. A few years later, we were playing in the yard, digging holes, doing things that kids did back in the day when there weren't any cartoons on TV 24 hours a day. My sister Pat dug up a ring. We were so excited because Patty found some buried treasure. I think we made plans to make a treasure map and bury it and then go find it again. But my sister Patty said, "No, it's mine," and wasn't interested in, losing it maybe. We went into the house to show our treasure, and my dad said, "You found my wedding ring." This is years later, and it was not in any place where anyone was the day with the cesspool, so I don't know. We were happy for him, but also bummed because now we had no treasure. At the time that my parents' wedding rings were sized for them, my dad had been working for a company called Railway Express in the city, which is just a delivery service. So he was loading and unloading trucks and delivering stuff and doing a lot of manual labor while he was going to school to become a teacher. His hands were swollen from doing physical work every day. But after the ring was found in the dirt, my dad had been teaching at an elementary school for many years at that time, and his hands got more like human size, and the ring had to be resized so he could wear it again because it was way too big. Life went on as it does, and I spent most of my youth being the black sheep of my family, drowning my fears and insecurity in alcohol and drugs. My relationship with my parents was not great, as I was resentful over my crappy childhood, and basically, I was not to be trusted. I got sober at 29, and our relationship changed after a while. I felt I had to make up for my part, and once I moved to New Hampshire, my family and I would go down to Long Island and help my parents do outdoor maintenance or deep clean the house and just do things that my parents weren't able to do as they were getting older. And we just went there and did it. We didn't ask because they would never have accepted any help. But if you just go there and, while I'm there, I'll do 8 loads of laundry. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. In 2007, my mom was diagnosed with lung cancer, and it was inoperable. Although she was in her late 70s, and she had been smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a year for about 60 years. So the fact that she didn't get cancer until she was almost 80 was pretty much a Christmas miracle. For a few years, she had weekly treatments and was given medication that was basically just horrible poison, but they were hoping that it would kill the cancer before it killed her. She slid slowly into dementia, whether from the cancer or from age or from bad health, who knows. And I spent a few weeks a month with them in my childhood home, and eventually my mom ended up just staying in the oncology ward of a big teaching hospital. Those places are not set up for dementia patients. So once she was there, I would spend as many hours a day and sometimes stay overnight in a giant chair just because sometimes she would wake up and be afraid. She would think that her and my dad went to the hospital to visit a friend and somehow they got separated and that my dad left her there on accident and then they thought she was a patient and put her in a bed. So I would have to explain to her, no, Mom, you have lung cancer and it's really bad. And she would go, I have lung cancer? No wonder I feel so terrible. And then she would go to sleep. And so, but it was tough. I'm not sure she knew who I was sometimes, but I would read to her and bribe the nurses. Every day I would stop at Starbucks and get whatever the nurses at the corner station needed, whatever they wanted. And I would come in every day and like, go, here you go. And they were always like, oh, Gail, it's so nice to see you. Your mom's doing good, you know. And this is a hint. If you have an elderly relative in a hospital unit for a long time, being not only polite, but very kind to the nursing staff, then they will see your elderly relative as a person with people who care about them, as opposed to that crazy lady who keeps screaming all night, why am I in the hospital? It helped a lot, I think. Anyway, I digress. So I'm spending a lot of time with just her and I in the hospital, sitting next to each other. And she told me at some point when my dad was in the room, because he would just come in the room and sit 3 feet from the bed and read the newspaper. And that was visiting my mom in the hospital. Like, I don't know, whatever. He had polio as a child and spent many years in a charity hospital for children with polio. So he wasn't very excited about hospitals. But when my dad was in the room, a couple of times my mom would tell me that when I was a baby, I used to love to chew on her wedding ring. And it might have been me, or it might have been one of my sisters, because, you know, she was a little sketchy with, you know, who's that person? She would always say, who's that? And I'm like, that's the guy that brings the food, Mom. Who's that? Oh, that's the lady who's coming to take your temperature. And then I would go into the bathroom. When I would come out, she would ask one of the nurses, who's that? And the nurse would say, that's your daughter, Gail. And she would go, oh, that's right. You know what I mean? Like, so it was pretty much, you know, I don't know who it was that chewed on the ring. She told me that story a lot, and my dad heard it a lot when we were there. The day before she died, her body was shutting down, and her hands and feet were swelling up, and she kept, like, pulling at her ring. And so I went to get the nurse, and I said, I don't know what's going on, but she's getting really agitated. And the nurse said, if you want the ring, we should take it off her, because otherwise, when she passes away, we'll either have to, like, take the finger or have to cut it off. And my dad said, of course, my dad growing up in the Depression and, you know, being a cranky old Irishman, said, well, don't leave it here in a drawer. Somebody will steal it. Somebody on the, you know, they're going to get you. That's, you know, my parents were always, like, paranoid and freaked out. My dad was, my mom wasn't. So anyway, my dad was worried that someone would steal it. And then he said, will it fit you? And I'm like, I don't know. So the nurse came in and, like, put lotion on my mom's hand, and we got the ring off. And my dad's like, well, put it on. So I put it on, and I'm like, oh, it fits. And he's like, there, keep it. So at the time, it was in 2009, and we had, they had pretty good Wi-Fi at Stony Brook University Hospital on Long Island. And so I had this crappy little Dell laptop that work had given me so I could work out of office. And so I was IMing with my sisters. Like, how's she today? What's going on now? Like, constantly, like 20, back and forth. So I messaged my sisters and asked if any of them would mind if I wore Mom's wedding ring, you know? After I got it off her cold, almost dead finger, because that's how my family is. We're just awful, and we think the weirdest things are funny. So we all cracked up, and my one sister went, ew, no, you can have it. And then my other sister went, well, I did like the ring, but, you know, I don't think it would fit me, so go nuts. My mom passed away the next day, and that was in 2009. In less than a year, my dad moved up to live with us. He moved from his mother's house into a house with my mom and had never lived by himself. Like, after my mother died, like a couple of weeks later, he called me up from Long Island to New Hampshire to ask me if I knew where the manual for the washing machine was. So he was 78 years old and had never used a washing machine. He had no idea, like, how does this thing work, And I'm like, Dad, you and Mom bought that washing machine in the 70s. Like, there's no manual. Like, it's gone. And that's when me and my sisters made plans to move my dad. And we had a big enough house, so he came to live with us. My dad had polio when he was a child, and when he got to be in his 70s, he started having post-polio syndrome, which is you have really bad palsy. It looks like Parkinson's, but so he was unable to cook for himself. He couldn't like write notes or a check. So he moved in with us and became part of our family. In 2011, because he had polio as a kid, he had really bad COPD, which is another reason he moved up with us. And every now and then we were around the house, and I'd take him out to make sure he'd come out to the porch and sit there, and I'd fill the bird feeders, and he'd watch the birds and yell at the squirrels because, whatever, it was exciting and kept him from going mental. And he always stayed sharp. He really did, up till his last days. And every now and then he would say, "How's your mom's ring?" And I would hold up my hand. This is the ring right here. You can't really see it, but this ring. And I would go, "It's good. It's safe. I have it right here." And then we would laugh, and go about our business. During my crazy days, like back before I got sober, I would steal jewelry from family and sell it to get money for alcohol and drugs. So it wasn't as odd of a question as you thought it might be for him to keep asking me, "Still have the ring?" Luckily, he didn't say, "Did you pawn it yet and go buy drugs?" But I didn't. So he was getting near the end of his life, and due to his low oxygen, he would take out his cannula all the time because he found it annoying. But then his oxygen levels would drop really badly, and he would start to hallucinate. So I would go in the back to bring him his lunch or see if he wanted to come on the porch or whatever, and he was like, "When did your sister and her husband leave?" And I'd be like, "What?" And he was like, "Well, they were just here visiting." And I was like, "Oh, a while ago. I don't know." And when the nurse came in, I was like, "What is going on?" He was like, "Oh, Mr. So-and-so was here today," who was the guy that was the superintendent of the school district that he used to teach at a really long time ago, and the guy had been dead for a long time. And so I asked the nurse, and she said, "That's the low oxygen talking." She goes, "But at least he thinks he's getting a lot of visitors, and he seems happy. So, just if you see he pulled it out, put it back in." Then he started to go down pretty quickly. And he would struggle to breathe because COPD is just like your lungs are full of soup. So it doesn't matter how hard you try to make yourself breathe, you just can't get it. So there was a nurse in there checking on him, and usually when the nurses were in there, they, nakeded him up and cleaned him up and stuff. So I didn't like to be in the room because even though I, took care of him and wiped his butt and stuff like that, he was still my dad, and I like to pretend that I wasn't taking care of him. So anyway, the nurse called out to me, "Can you come in? Your father's really agitated." So I went into the room. I could see him, and he was pawing at his hand, on his left hand. And he had been in and out of lucidity for a day or so. But he looked me right in my eye and said clear as a bell, he said, he tried to pull his ring off and said, "Put it with the other one." And so I knew what he meant. So I went to the bedside table and got the lotion, and the nurse and I once again pulled a wedding ring off someone's swollen, almost dead hand, and she handed it to me, and my mother's ring fits me, my dad's ring is too big, so I put it on my hand, and then I put my mother's on my hand, and I went, "See that?" And the last words he ever spoke where he just nodded and went "That's right, it's safe now, it's safe." And then that was the end of him. They were the last words he spoke, and he died a day and a half later. My parents weren't the best people in the world, and neither am I. But I'm glad I was able to be there for them when they needed me. My work, family, and where we lived just made these choices easy. At times when I was out of my mind and I felt I couldn't continue, my husband said this to me. He said, "Sweetheart, when you were younger, you were the horrible daughter, and all your sisters were the good ones." He said, "Now it's your turn to be the good daughter." It was so true, and I'm really glad that I got the chance to help them out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gail. I love that story. It's very sweet, and I think we all can relate to that, how much we love our rings. Okay, so next up, we have Holly Russell. She's a mom, a feminist, an educator who has taught high school and college English. Her life goal is to make critical thinkers out of as many kids as she can, which we badly need right now, I think. And this is her first time at Long Story Short, so please give her a warm welcome, Holly Russell.
And thank you, Gail. That was really touching. So people say that we are like the people we came from. And I came from a woman with a thick Worcester accent. She is loud and gregarious. And I love my mom, but I'm not much like that. She came from a woman, however, who was a bit subtle, and she was sarcastic. She did a lot of eye rolling. My grandmother wore clip-on earrings. She had a musical doorbell and a big mouth Billy Bass, and she got a real kick out of sandpipers, but she would call them all fools. She called my sister and I puppy, and she used to bow down to let us pat her like aqua-netted perm and watch it bounce back up. She was great. My grandmother's name was Gloria, and every morning she would, quote, do her stretches, and then she would go for like 2-mile, 3-mile walks. And when my sister and I were around, we would join her, mostly because we loved to hear her talk. She told stories about growing up poor in Worcester in the 1930s, about going to dances with her sister, who she said was the beautiful one. She was just the cute one. And they would do the jitterbug. She told us about how when my grandfather came back from World War II, he slept with his hand under his pillow, clutching an imaginary weapon. If we're like the people we came from, I am like her in at least one way. Gloria was anxious, but she figured out kind of how to control her worry through compulsive cleaning and through faith. When I first learned to drive, she pinned a golden guardian angel to the driver's side visor of my first crappy car, and she was one of my first passengers. She would kind of fastidiously read her Catholic prayer books while I backed up too quickly or signaled too late. I was a very bad driver. So if we're like the people we came from, I am like her in that I also inherited this generational anxiety, and yet without the consolations of faith. When I was 19 and Gloria died suddenly from an aneurysm, it just felt like a crushing void. She was just gone. Not everyone, of course, shares those cold, hard thoughts about the finality of death. To the Inca, for example, the dead remained socially alive, ties to their relatives transcending physical existence. The dead determined marriages, they influenced the fertility of their living relatives and of the land itself. They basically intervened in the daily affairs of their people. I learned about the Inca 4 years after Gloria's death, when my friend Christina and I backpacked through South America. We operated always under one key assumption, and that was that I would do all the planning. Having control can be a sort of antidote to anxiety, so this worked for me. I knew my sister Nicole and our friend Katie would love Peru, so I gave them my pitch. It was basically like, just get a plane ticket to Cusco, and I will figure out our hostel stays. I'll make sure they're cheap. I'll make sure that we get occasional cold showers. I will negotiate overnight bus rides to new places. I will get us malaria medication. We'll go to the Amazon, and I'll plan a trek to Machu Picchu. The problem with the Machu Picchu plan was we didn't have the money or the permit for the Inca Trail. So I read about alternatives. The least traveled being an off-the-beaten-path 4-day trek through the Lares Valley, and that was the one I picked. So we hired a guide, 2 porters and 2 mules, and I gave Nicole and Katie just 2 days to acclimate when they got there. They came from sea level, and here we are at a city of, 2 miles in the sky. So in those 2 days, Katie fainted twice in dramatic and very public fashion. And the worry crept in. I was responsible. I could control our plans, but not her body's reaction to them. And the worry got worse as we left Cusco for our trek. In Cusco, we had slurped hot soup for breakfast, ladled by moms, amongst people. We enjoyed these sunny street parades, and just everything about it was comforting. So my worry got worse as we drove further and further away from that place, and into a place where the cold killed, and potatoes and guinea pigs, cuy, kept the hardy Quechua alive. I felt like my grandmother must have felt when she read those prayer books while I drove. Like, holy shit, what if? And yet she'd had faith. So we drove up into the mountains to where our trek would begin. Our driver pulled over. With Sylvia, our guide, we were 5 women alone in this desolate landscape until we weren't, because now we could see this little speck of red in the distance, and it got closer and closer, and we watched as the speck became a little girl. She was wearing a red shawl, she had crimson cheeks, she had black hair, and she was just curious about us. So Sylvia asked her name in Quechua. Gloria, she said. It was the name of a person I needed. My sister and I looked at one another, a burning between our ribs, yearning for someone who would have been praying for us. There was just something in hearing our grandmother's name there and then. So our porters arrived on foot, and then we got off on our way. The trek began with an Incan ritual offering of coca leaves in the earth of the Urubamba Mountains. This was a sacred practice, but we chewed it, for practical purposes, to ward off hunger and to have the strength to hike at altitude all day. The Inca had discovered these benefits, and where we now put our feet, they had long before made spiritual journeys of death, offering children for emperors on mountaintops. It was honorable. Our well-cushioned steps on the trek carried far less weight. We hiked all day, and as the sun went down, we set up camp near the mud floor, 1-room home of an Andean family. They were the first people we had seen since Gloria. It was cold, and the air was thin. Cuy scrambled about in the home, kind of keeping warm and growing fat until the harvest. Children smiled from inside ponchos, their ankles naked. We wore everything we had and shivered by the fire before bed, feeling spiritual and welcome. But I also was feeling queasy. And as I got into my sleeping bag that night, I quickly became aware that I was more sick than I had ever been in my entire life. And I retched and I wreathed and I did not sleep at all. I couldn't keep down water, nothing. As the sun rose, my head was throbbing. It just felt like there was a steel boot kicking me over and over again. But it was time to move onward. We had no choice. There were no phones, no vehicles, very few people within a 2-day walk of our location. And we were about to pass over 14,000 feet that day before we descended. So it was decided that I should ride on the back of a mule. And for the next 8 delirious hours, the men in my crew carried my extra cargo and what had originally been on the mule on their own backs. And I worshiped that animal and those men as they carried me up and over crags. I thought I was going to die on the back of a donkey. I got into my sleeping bag as soon as we got to our next camp. I still couldn't eat or drink. I was weak, dizzy, and dehydrated, and I just kept thinking, I need Gatorade. I just need Gatorade. I went to sleep, and I had these weird emotional dreams. And in them, I felt my grandmother's kind of unmistakable presence, you know, those dreams. Because it turns out the dead can sneak into the brains of the living. They can take up space in our dreams, our stories, making fun of the seabirds that they love, or telling stories about dances and PTSD. Just the utterance of their names can resurrect them. And these dreams, these stories, have the power to sustain us. So to make a long story short, the next day I crawled out of my tent, barely alive, and on the ground was a bottle of that sweet synthetic blue sports drink. Electrolyte, I read. And my sister and friends were so excited to tell me that while I had slept, another girl just appeared in this desolate landscape miraculously. And she carried a blanket over her shoulder, and when she got in front of them, she kind of laid it on the ground. And there were just a couple of incongruous, you know, items on it. There were like tissues, Q-tips, and the bottle of that knockoff Gatorade. The rationalist in me knows that this little girl, her family, had those items on hand just in case a pack of gringas passed through us. And yet, this felt like a miracle, like divine, or more precisely, ancestral intervention. It felt like Gloria was in that. I drank the electrolyte. I started to feel better. It was like how my grandmother's hair would spring back up after I patted it down, the aerosol having done its job. I wouldn't lie flat. I hiked that day and the next, finally ascending those sacred final steps to the holy citadel in the clouds of a people who always knew the dead lived. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. I love that story, and the entire time you're describing going up the mountain and everything, I'm just like, nope, nope, no, no. But I'm extremely impressed, extremely impressed. So if you have ever been to a Long Story Short show before, you have been in the theater. I'm up on the stage now, and we have people kind of throughout over there. I was just like waving to Holly. And one of the things that we always do here is we have this audience participation element to the show. It's this wonderfully like kind of awkward, chaotic way to open up the second half. So I have people put their names in this pink pumpkin right here. At the beginning, right after intermission, I pull a name out, and that person has to get on stage and tell a story right there on the spot. So we can't do that tonight, but we wanted to try to come up with some sort of way for us to have a level of audience participation. So we asked for folks to send in some stories, and the pink pumpkin story we have selected for tonight was sent in by Jeanette Manzi of Arlington, Virginia. And she's an Army veteran who participated in the Armed Services Arts Partnership storytelling program last year, and that's where she fell in love with telling stories. So we have tonight a Long Story Short Advisory Board member and awesome storyteller in her own right, Debbie Kane, here to perform Jeanette's written submission. So I'm going to hand it off to Debbie.
Thank you. So, I threw my mother into the ocean 4 years ago, and I'm so glad I did it. My mom was an interesting woman who was fiercely independent, intelligent, took no crap from anybody, and had a pretty good life. She was also kind of a nut, especially as she got older. Going out in public with her was always a funny adventure because you never knew what she was going to say or do. My mom loved to travel, and one of her favorite places was Alaska. She just loved the beauty of it. She would say, "Alaska is so beautiful. I really would like to live there one day." She encouraged my love of travel so I too could appreciate the beauty of other places. And she hoped I would travel somewhere and come back with a husband because she knew I'd be all by myself when she was gone. One of our last conversations was about travel. One night she said, "You know, I would like to be cremated, go on one last trip with you, and have you scatter my ashes in water somewhere." The time came not long after that conversation when my mom was 90 years old. I took her ashes and got on a ship in Seattle where I met with a crew member to arrange a time to scatter my mom's ashes during the cruise. The cruise was to Alaska, a place I chose because she loved it so. One night on the ship, I stopped by the gift shop and bought a single red rose to put in the water with her ashes. Roses were something else she really loved, and we always had a backyard full of them when I was growing up. On one of the last days of the cruise, I was escorted to a private area of the ship, and I scattered my mom's ashes at sea with that single rose. Well, actually, I threw her ashes in the sea. I wasn't about to be like you see in the movies, having ashes blown back on me as I tried to scatter them delicately into the water. I had my mom's ashes put in a biodegradable urn that I could throw into the water with absolutely no chance of ash blowback. As I watched the urn dip below the water, I was happy to be able to do that for my mom, even though part of me felt like I was leaving her behind. The next day, I was given a framed letter of condolences from the captain. I was really touched, and when I read it through a second time, I noticed that my mom must have been channeling through the captain when he wrote that letter, because it seemed even he wished I had a husband. The letter addressed me as Mrs., even though I am still single. It was then that I knew I didn't leave her behind, and that my mom would always be with me.
Thanks, Debbie, and thanks, Jeanette, for sending in your story. All right, we are at our last storyteller. Next up, we have Charlene Thorburn. Charlene is a curious curator of life's full spectrum with discriminating tastes that range from luxurious to the divey, which is relatable. And she's a connoisseur of the quirky, dancing to the beat of her own French horn. She loves food, cats, and some people. Please welcome a great person and a great storyteller, Charlene Thorburn.
Thanks, Beth. So it's August 2018, and I have a hike planned with Michael Himberger, dad of my best childhood friend, Sarah. Still emotionally raw from the passing of my own dad 2 months prior, a good hike was just what I needed. To some, hiking is an emotional pain reliever due to the distraction of physical suffering and the meditative quality of putting one foot in front of the other. To others, hiking is an adrenaline sport. While he really tries to adhere to sauntering and the reverence of the woods and mountains, Michael is after all of the adrenaline the White Mountains have to offer. But he's a great guide to have, having hiked New Hampshire's 4,000 footers in all seasons. I don't think he's been to Machu Picchu, I don't know. As well as mountains, big and small, all over the country. We'd hiked a couple times in my adulthood, the Wildcats in fall and Mount Chicorowa in winter. But most of our adventures were when his daughter Sarah and I were in our childhood. We even had a song she and I made up that we would sing called Mountain Man, the best lyric being, "He towers taller than the tallest tree. He climbs all the mountains before 2:45. There's more. So Mountain Man has chosen the hike we'll do. The Flume Slide Trail to Mount Flume and Mount Liberty, lovingly referred to by White Mountains hikers as Flibberty. I'm well aware that it's going to be a tough one, nearly 10 miles and 3,700 foot elevation gain over some very rough, steep, rocky terrain. What I learned just this past year was that this particular trail, the Flume Slide, is on a list of trails known as the Terrifying 25. But at the time, I'm game, but definitely nervous going to sleep the night before and when I woke up that morning for the hike. But the trail warms you up pretty nicely for about 3 miles with relatively flat and level trail, and then it becomes very apparent where the work begins. Soon enough, you're leaning into the mountain, into the grade, using your hands to help you scramble up the perpetually wet granite slabs. I actually love a good scramble. We're having a great time. We both are. And I think Michael's actually proud of how well I was keeping up, considering I was not in the best hiking shape at the time. We are grunting through gradual steps up the mountain. It's getting very steep. Making pretty good time, though. When very quickly, in the matter of 2 seconds, Michael's left arm slips from under him on a bit of wet slab, and he hits the left side of his face just above his eyebrow, and his face just goes white with this stunned and quietly pained look on it. And I think, oh my God, you hit your head. Are you okay? and he just so quietly says, "I've broken my arm." No way, no. We were on part of the trail that was nothing but straight up rock slab. Where were we going to go? Up? Down? Couldn't we just vaporize and not be here? My God. We find a flattish spot to evaluate his injury. I hope for just a second he's mistaken. But when we roll up his sleeve, the disgusting deformity that is an anterior shoulder dislocation stares right back at me. Fuck. Screaming on the inside, but only whimpering and swearing a lot on the outside. I instinctively I gave him a hug. I think I petted him on the head or something. I felt terrible, and I just wanted this to not be happening. So, Dr. Quinn, medicine woman, she reduced drunk Hank's shoulder with whiskey and a belt, I'm sure. But I'm not Dr. Quinn. I'm a PA at a walk-in, and when someone comes in with an injury like this, it is an easy referral directly to the ER. I don't know how to fix this. I called an orthopedic friend who would know, but when I called, I could hear her, and she couldn't hear me. Hello? Hello? Oh my God, so much for a walkthrough. The utter helplessness mounted. You see, Michael was precious cargo to me. He was responsible for most of the cultural and outdoor experiences of my childhood, since my own parents, being self-proclaimed homebodies, sadly did nothing and went nowhere outside of work and home. I was always invited along with him and Sarah, and he was like my second dad. Whether it was the recent passing of my own dad or just the years of love and admiration for this guy, seeing him hurt and vulnerable just broke my heart. Here he was, with his wind just completely taken out of his sails. We were noticed by a man and his teenage son. They came over to us. His name was Mickey. He says, "I'm a physician." Oh, thank God. I tell him what's wrong, and the same helpless look that's probably on my face goes across his. He tells us he's a hernia surgeon in Boston. Bless his heart. We give Michael maximum doses of ibuprofen and Tylenol and make a couple of really piss-poor and unsuccessful attempts at reducing the shoulder. We just decide to wrap his arm close to his body and start a slow descent down. Other hikers rig up ropes from tree to tree to help a now one-armed Michael get down this steep up-only trail. Mickey and his son, they hike the whole way down with us. They totally stopped their day and gave us their day, just so we weren't alone. And it's slow. We need to stop and let Michael sit every 5 minutes or so because the movement of going downhill just pulls on his unstable joint with every step. But his stoicism amazes me the entire time. I'm almost in tears, and maybe from carrying 2 packs down the flume slide, but mostly feeling overwhelmed by the realization of how much he and his family have meant to me over the years. By about 4 p.m., long after 2:45, and no mountains climbed, we finally arrive at Memorial Hospital ER in Conway, where he is a well-established patient. Don't tell Judy until we get to the hospital has been the plan the entire time. Judy is his wonderful and chronically worried wife, one of my other mothers growing up, if Michael didn't regularly give her reason to worry. He's checked in. He has his x-ray. It's dislocated, as we know. And there are also some small fractures, probably made worse by Mickey and I yanking on it. And Judy finally meets us, so worried. She's so worried. But I try to reassure her that he's good now. Look at him, smiling happily with a bunch of Dilaudid on board. Orthopedics comes down, and they tell us they need to knock him out to fix this. I feel slightly better about any trailside medical shortcomings. So Judy and I were exhausted. We go over to May Kelly's for a drink and a bite to eat to soothe our nerves and hunger. I was starving at this point. While Michael is finally put back together, we're called when he's ready for discharge. And when we arrive, he is still feeling the effects of the sedation drugs. He's holding court with all the recovery nurses, cracking them up, and apparently they already have some inside jokes. No adrenaline here, but drugs is drugs. By the end of the night, my relief is matched only by my exhaustion, and I happily get to spend another night under the roof of my dear, dear Himburgers. On the ride back, Michael tells me how grateful he was for my presence and support throughout the course of the day, and I say, you're very welcome. But in my mind, I thank him for his presence and support throughout the course of my life. Those we love most, our most precious cargo, can only be defined by the heart. Family is family, and it is indeed all relative.
Thank you, Charlene. And thanks everyone who tuned in tonight. That's our show. If you want to hear more stories like the ones you heard tonight, you can check out the podcast, and it's available everywhere you can listen to your favorite podcasts. And go to longstoryshortpod.com for information about upcoming shows, becoming a future storyteller. We love having new people come and share their stories with us. We have a lot of opportunity for people to get up on stage in 2021. So please go there and check us out. I hope to see you in June, and have a good night.